Welcome to Theory Neutral, the podcast about stuff languages do. I'm Jacob.
I'm Logan.
I'm Aiden.
And today we will talk about the paper Conative Calls to Animals, from Arusa Maasai to a cross-linguistic prototype by Alexander Andrason and Michael Karani. So I think the title itself is, well, probably for the initiated it's very descriptive, but for me it wasn't that descriptive because I had no damn clue what conative calls are. So I think we should probably start by kind of answering the questions, what are those conative calls to animals? I broke it up into some different factors. So first of all, conative. What is conative? It expresses wishes, desires, demands, orders, intentions, stuff like that. So basically, calls to animals is pretty clear, I think. Basically, you want the animal to do something, and that's why you talk to it. That's basically the thing. So some common English examples are like maybe for cats, pss, 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 or giddy up for a horse, or whoa, heel. I'm not sure. I didn't know that heel one, but good to know.
That's a dog command.
Yeah.
Oh, right. Okay. I was guessing horse, but makes sense, I suppose. So the distinguishing factors, there are several, like distinguishing them from other parts of speech, and not only by those properties that we will discuss later, but they are also distinguished from other interjections and other conative interjections by their marginalization, or basically that they are not that present in literature. Like they are very, very, very under-researched, and I think the paper itself lists a couple of examples, and it was interesting to see, and because there weren't that many languages that they were talking about. So like Ewe, which is from West Africa, then Matses, which is from Amazonia, so I'm happy again. Nosa, which is, I think, how you pronounce that. So there's a couple of languages, right? But it's still very understudied.
Yeah, I feel like that's sort of... I mean, partially it's the fact that this stuff is kind of peripherally linguistic. Like, it's definitely linguistic, but it's kind of at the edge of grammar and how a language works. But also, I think a lot of us are coming at this from kind of a cultural blind spot, because modern developed countries, most people don't really interact with the same variety of animals and the same, in the same variety of ways as people in a lot of other societies. And, I don't need a special call for get cows moving, because I may have never interacted with an actual cow in my life other than eating its flesh.
Yeah, it depends on where you're from.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah. And I suppose if you... Well, it depends obviously on the type of research you're doing, but if we assume that some linguist goes, I don't know, into some country, some under-researched area, maybe Papua New Guinea, maybe Amazonia, and they try to document the language, I think the first thing they do is, trying to figure out the phonological inventory, trying to figure out the morphology, the syntax, write a reference grammar, maybe to create some pedagogical material for the speakers. But I think those conative calls to animals, they're, as you said, they're not only, they're in the periphery of, linguistics, as you said, but also I think when we consider linguistic descriptions, I've never seen a grammar. I'm not even sure. They cite Matses, and I'm not sure what they cite there, whether that's the grammar. I think it might be the grammar, but it could also be like a normal paper just about this type of interjection.
They're not going to come up in elicitation sessions if you're doing field work, because they're explicitly not things you say to humans.
Yeah, so if you're coming from a Western society, are you ever going to think to ask what they use to call their goats?
True.
You're not going to remember to elicit that, and it's not going to come up naturally.
Yeah, it's like something you can easily just scoot to the side and just say, yeah, I'm dealing with that later, but maybe you're not dealing with it at all at the end. Mm-hmm. So this is also what Logan just said is also a special thing about those conative calls, because this time our addressee, our interlocutor, who we are talking to, is not a human.
They are not a locutor.
So they animals can't talk back to us. The paper words this pretty nicely as they are not in command of the linguistic system. Basically, they can't talk to us, but we can talk to them. But they can still, and that's the important part, they can still react accordingly. If I say pss, pss, pss to a cat, she or he, they, the cat, will come.
maybe.
If they've learned what that means.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, obviously. Yeah. But the point is they can't talk back, but they will still do what you want them to if they're, like as you said, if they're trained accordingly, yeah.
In the case of a cat, if they are so inclined at that particular moment, but...
Yes.
Yeah, so it's an interesting case of, it's a process of communication that's kind of one way in the end, because there's only one person doing the actual, linguistic communication, but the responding party is still able to receive the information and respond accordingly, even if they can't respond in the same medium with an actual linguistic response. So one of the interesting things that this paper does is it takes a little bit of linguistic ideas, principles, theory even, from linguistics in general, and applies it to actually doing linguistics in a way that I've never quite seen done before, but makes a lot of sense. And specifically, rather than trying to set up a clear definition of a conative animal call, they say there is a prototypical conative animal call, and most, we're going to call them CACs going forward, because conative animal call is hard to say every time.
Sounds good.
Most CACs are, somehow related to that prototype in a very clear way, but they may not have every single property of that prototype, and they may, you may not be able to find a single property that covers even most actual CACs out in the world. So what they do is, rather than setting up a definition of things that have this property are CACs and things that don't aren't, they say the prototypical CAC has this list of, they've got 15 or 20 individual properties. And then they go on to say, you don't have to necessarily have all of these to be a CAC. You will have some combination of them, to varying degrees, and there's probably a point where you don't have enough to really count anymore. But it's taking the idea of prototypes from semantics and from, understanding how humans think about words and applying it to actually defining technical terms, which is really kind of cool, I think.
They have a big section in the paper that's just a discussion of, what prototype theory is, which was kind of surprising to me, because I came into this thinking, well, obviously everybody already knows what prototype theory is. Why do you have to go over it in your paper on this specific thing? But, I guess apparently it's weird to just apply it to linguistics all over the place. And the fact that I think it's normal might be a major bias in my professional training. So prototype theory just generally comes from studying semantics and figuring out how people know what words mean at all. So I don't think we need to spend 15 minutes on the podcast going over the whole history of prototype theory and specific applications and such. But a really prototypical example of prototype theory is, what is the definition of a bird? What things are birds? Most people can identify a bird if they see one, but we all kind of understand that some birds are more birdish than other birds. So penguins, yeah, technically they're birds, but are they really? Because penguins are not prototypical birds. So for me, at least, the prototypical bird is something like an American robin. It's small, it tweets, it flies around, it's kind of fluffy and cute, it has a beak, cats like to hunt it, and penguins have some of those features, they have feathers, they have a beak, they don't fly, they're kind of cute sometimes. So the idea of a bird is not a binary category where you can say, yes, this is a bird, no, that is not a bird, for everything in the world.
Yeah, if you're talking about popular definition, there is a technical definition of bird.
Well, yes, but it's a gradient. And really, like, that's how most words that people use are.
The example that I have always come back to in this regard is the question, is a hot dog a sandwich?
Right. Yes, that's another.
There's such a nice meme.
Because asking that question is basically trying to take a prototype-based word and understand it in definition terms. And it just doesn't work. Because we don't have a definition for sandwich. We have a prototype. And a hot dog is kind of right at the edge.
Yeah, and it doesn't work largely because different people have different ideas of what the prototype of every category is. And so communication happens because the fuzzy blobs of our individual prototypes overlap sufficiently, and miscommunication happens when they don't overlap sufficiently, like whether or not you think a hot dog is a sandwich.
I think a nice way that paper not visualizes it, it mentions it in text, but the way I visualize it, because to me, to be honest, the whole prototype thing, I know it not from cognitive science, I don't know it from semantics, I actually know it from typology. So that's actually, I'm coming from a kind of different angle here. But the key words that really stuck with me, that with which you can really visualize the whole thing, is radial network. Because if you think of the whole thing of kind of like a target, like those discs you got like for darts, for example. And you got the bullseye, you got the outer thing, like you got the bullseye, then the different circles, basically, And you can think of conative calls to animals or any other prototype-based typological category. You can think of those as encompassing the entire dart disc.
Dartboard.
In the middle, there's like the most typical, the most common manner in which those CACs are handled, but it doesn't mean that this prototype, like this bullseye, really exists like that out there. It's just this constructed thing of this constitutes what CACs are, and if a language has, for example, we can think of a language as throwing darts at the board. And if for example, the dart sticks into the bullseye, we can say, okay, that's a prototypical CAC because it's got those properties that are located in the bullseye. Those are the most prototypical, the canonical properties of CACs. And the farther you go outside, the less prototypical the CAC system will become. So you've got canonical, semi-canonical, and non-canonical CACs systems. Yeah, so basically that's how I imagine it in my head, with this radial approach. Because in the middle you've got like the most common things, and then as you go farther outside, you get the rarer things, those that are not as prototypically associated with the category.
Yeah. In the bullseye, you've got the American Robin and the PB&J, and way out at the edge, you've got the penguin and the Navajo taco.
Right, exactly. So I suppose the next question would be actually to look at CACs in this language, in Arusa Maasai, and look at what they are like, what they look like, what they sound like, and what their meanings are.
Yeah, basically this paper, it goes through the properties. Yeah. It spends almost all of its time talking about the properties of CACs in Arusa Maasai, and from there it sort of generalizes a general prototypical idea of a CAC, mostly based on one language's data, which is a little odd, but again, like they mentioned, there's not a lot out there about this stuff, so you can't really blame them.
I would have preferred to see some more diversity, just based on, because they had the data. They at the end they spent talking a bit about Polish and Lithuanian, and they mentioned that Matses, like the Amazonian language, also has those. So it would have been nice to see some more variety with concrete examples from other languages. And obviously I am biased towards Amazonia, so Matses would have been very nice. But I think even with just Arusa, those prototypes at the end, they seem pretty consistent. And I mean, the way Arusa handles it is also pretty interesting. It's not like it's boring or anything.
Yeah, and if nothing else, a lot of the prototypical ideas seem very intuitively reasonable, so, to the degree that that's valuable.
Yeah. So let's start with the semantics, the types of meanings that are actually encoded by those CACs. And we will actually get some examples in there later when we talk about phonetics, and that's going to be the fun part. But first of all, semantics. They say there are 4 basic types of meanings that are encoded by those interjections in Arusa. They have like special names, but I will explain what those labels actually mean. So the first one is summonses, which are basically commands like come here, basically summon, to summon an animal, basically. To come here, you dog, come on here, cow, something like that. And obviously the same thing goes into the other direction. So you can have dispersals. You can say, okay, go away dog, go away, go away cow, go away ox, something like that. And then you can also have directives, which are basically more specific, I think. So it's basically something like go hunt, go fight, go there, stop, halt, start moving again. Just indicating the direction in which you want the animal to go. And there we have this whole wanting the animal to go, that part, the conative part, basically. And then obviously the next thing will be the distinction of what referent you're talking about, what animal you're talking to.
You missed the last category, which I think is the most interesting one.
True, you can talk about it.
So category number 4, if I had not read this paper, I would never have thought that this was a thing that exists. But then they pointed it out, and I was like, oh yeah, it does exist. So, semantics unrelated to motion. I'm like, okay, you're talking to an animal. The animal can't talk back. It can't, have a conversation with you. What the heck are you going to say to an animal other than, go do a thing, execute a command? But turns out there are some things. And they give some examples. So there's things like comforting noises. If you've got a sick animal or a scared animal and you're trying to calm it down, you don't want it to go anywhere. You just want it to, not attack you the next time you have to do something to it. And there's CACs that are intended for that. And there's also, preparatory commands. So, I don't want my dog to go and start fighting that bear right now, but I want the dog to know that I might tell it to go start fighting the bear soon. So you can have specific CACs that are just, get the animal's attention and let it know you're gonna tell it to do something else later. And I don't know, there might have been a few others, but there's not a ton of those, so they all just kind of get globbed into things that aren't telling the animal to move yet.
That's what I wanted to say. Basically, those 3 types that I just talked about, those are very common, whereas this non-directional, as you might call it, those non-directional CACs are very scarce. They are not very common.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. But then additionally, we can categorize CACs by the type of referent, which again is a thing I never would have thought. Why would you have different words for talking to different animals? We don't have different words for talking to different types of people. Most of the time, unless you've got a register system going on, I guess.
Also, maybe something like, let me just chime in for a sec. Wasn't it allocutive? Allocutive markers. I think Basque has those where you have you say something, but you say it to a woman, and it's different morphology than when you say it to a man. Or the whole thing about allocutivity is, I think, about that.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. Yeah, so basically, I guess you could say that in a sense, CACs often have allocutive information fused into them.
Yes,
that's a good way to see it.
Particular species of animal being addressed.
So, I wouldn't have thought of it, because that's, not something that we do in English, at least.
Yeah.
If you ignore, specific titles or, terms of address, but, we don't conjugate our verbs or use totally different command forms to, tell a child versus the president to do something. But then, you look at the examples that Jacob gave of conatives in English right at the start, and you wouldn't say pss, pss, pss to a dog. That's specifically a thing that we are culturally aware you use to get the attention of cats. And giddy up, Nobody says that to an animal that isn't a horse, or at least something that you're riding on. So, yeah, once it was pointed out, even though I am a Western guy in an industrialized nation who has very little direct experience interacting with animals, like, oh my gosh, yeah, the few of these that I know, they totally actually do this. So, okay, cool. So that's apparently a really common thing. There are different calls for domestic animals versus wild animals, and domestic animal-directed CACs are quite reasonably a lot more diverse than wild animal-directed CACs. Because, like, on the one hand, yeah, you're probably going to be interacting with your cattle more often than you are interacting with a lion. But then, on the other hand, you have the opportunity to, like, actually train your cattle and get them to recognize particular commands. Whereas, if you are faced with a wild animal, by definition, they are not pre-trained. They have no freaking clue what you are saying to them, so you're probably not going to bother developing a huge repertoire of commands. And similarly, for totally reasonable reasons, wild animal-directed CACs overwhelmingly tend to be dispersals. So there's specific things that people say to, like, get a lion to go away, please, but we don't have examples of specific words that are used to summon a lion here or, like, calm the lion down, because why the heck would you ever want to do that?
Yeah, 99% of the time you're interacting with wild animals, probably what you want to do is make them go away.
Exactly.
Yeah, so it's perfectly natural. One of the interesting a couple of interesting properties about CACs compared to other kinds of interjections and other kinds of, one-word utterances is CACs typically have very specific, narrow, single meanings. You have a specific CAC for let's get moving, cows, or stay there, goat, or whatever it happens to be, which if you compare to other kinds of interjections like wow or hey, those tend to have wider ranges of meanings or multiple meanings, like in some dialects of English, hello is both a greeting and a ho, that's surprising. Or like wow, it has the very, very general definition of I am surprised by the magnitude of some property.
Yeah, exactly. So it can be like, wow, that's terrible.
Exactly.
And then on the other hand, it can be, wow, that's so cool, and that's totally like, if you look at it at the very broad angle, you can say, okay, that's approximately the same function, the same semantics. But in contrast to CACs, like CACs are very much more monosemous.
Compared to interjections, also CACs are unusual in that they are fundamentally, the paper calls it dialogical. They are fundamentally about getting information to somebody else. I mean, all of language ultimately is about getting information to somebody else, but like something like wow isn't the same I am giving you a command. I am giving you a heads up. It's just sort of I'm broadcasting information about my current mental state. Whereas CACs are very directed. You animal there, do thing. And they're also, in a similar vein, they're deliberate in a way that other interjections typically aren't. Like, wow, or oh, or hey. You could just sort of say those as an immediate knee-jerk reaction to some sort of a response, some sort of a situation. Whereas CACs are always a specific intentional communicative act rather than a, unintentional automatic response to some situation you're finding yourself in. I mean, obviously, like, if you see your cows starting to run away, you may very quickly respond by telling them not to do that. But that's not the same sort of, I had an emotion, and that instantly triggers a particular interjection the way that something like wow tends to work.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's expressing your emotional response and is much more direct.
You don't say pss, pss, pss on accident to a cat.
Exactly, and at the same time, you also wouldn't say uh-oh, so that you can express that you want this cow to stop. That's also a different point.
It's not a, okay, cow, do thing kind of communication action.
Yeah.
So the fact that they are, quote, explicitly dialogical has some interesting consequences that make me think of other parts of language. So to directly quote from the paper, In any case, the presence of an animal addressee is compulsory for a CAC to be produced in a grammatical manner.
Which is an odd use of the word grammatical.
Yeah, whether or not an utterance is judged as grammatical is dependent on the environment in which it is said, which feels a whole lot like deictics and demonstratives and like other weird kinds of deictics, like the English yay as an indicator of magnitude, where, you know, you say someone is yay high, for example. And that's like the kind of thing, like, it's not a CAC at all. Like, yay high is not a thing you say to an animal, but it's a thing that is only felicitous to utter if you are actually making a physical gesture at the same time you are saying it. So it's a little bit weird to say that grammaticality is dependent on the physical environment, but that's actually not completely unique to CACs. Like, it does show up elsewhere.
Yeah, I would probably use the term felicitous rather than grammatical, because it's not a structural property, it's a semantic property, or a discourse property.
Yeah, that too. But also, I think what would be a nice idea maybe for such kind of research, to see where at the interface between verbal and non-verbal communication, not in a sense of, sometimes you have non-verbal predication, which is basically just having copula instead of a verb. Not in that sense, but in the sense of, okay, what am I doing gesturally, and what am I doing with my voice? So it would be interesting to see if those Maasai, those Arusa Maasai people, whether they have any gestures associated with those CACs, because I think a lot of the pragmatics behind CACs also rely on gestural manners. You wouldn't say, like, if I think about it, okay, Aidan can see me and Logan can see me, but the listeners can't. But you wouldn't wave away while trying to say to a cow, come here, something like that. Or maybe you would in that language, I think that's also an interesting tidbit you could maybe investigate in the future. If any of you want any research ideas, and if you have enough spare time to document CACs in some language, then yeah, maybe that would be a nice idea for a paper. I mean, it would be definitely interesting. I mean, you definitely need some literature for that, because I have no clue about this interface. But anyhow, let's move on to the part that I've already foreshadowed, which is phonetics. How do you actually say those CACs in Maasai? And this is actually the fun part, as I've written it here. This is the fun part where we get to read out all those transcriptions. We won't read out all of them, but we will read out the funny ones, and, well, fun ones, not funny.
I can totally produce an ingressive endolabial click.
That's, yeah. I can't.
I had no idea what they were trying to get at with the capital B and an apostrophe.
There's stuff like shh, or something like that, or something like, clicks. And I think that's also nice transition, because as Logan just said, ingressive endolabial clicks, that's pretty strange, for language to have this type of phonetics. But that's also the key point, because what the paper says is that those CACs, they basically tend to use extra systematic material when it comes to phonetics. They either use sounds that are not used in human language at all, just like the ingressive endolabial click, or also whistles, although one has to note there are whistled registers, and for example, Piraha in that one Silbo Gomero register of Spanish on Gomero.
Yeah.
And also some Mixtec languages, not Mixtec, Mixtec, thank you. And so whistled registers exist, but the point is you use them in registers and they're still extra systematic.
We can do a whole other episode on how whistling works and how that interacts with human language.
True.
But the main point is, it is uncontroversial that whistles are not integrated into the phonology of any natural language as like part of their normal phonological inventory.
Yeah. But it's also worth noting that the CACs in Maasai have a full range, everything from a sequence of clicks with no vowels or anything, all the way to, like, just a word, like something that's a perfectly phonologically valid word. They've got stuff I think is like mepa or something. Like, that's another CAC. There's a CAC that's literally, and then there's a CAC that's mepa.
Yeah.
Like, one of those sounds like it could be a word.
Exactly.
One of those doesn't sound at all like it could be a word. And so there's a whole range from totally extra-linguistic sound system to it could just be a word. It just isn't.
Yeah. And also another point when we talk about this extra systematicity, as I just said, there's sounds that are not used in human language at all. There is what Aidan just said, which is basically you have perfectly normal words, you have perfectly systematic phonetic material, basically. But there's also a part in between, I suppose, where CACs use sounds that are used generally in human language across languages, but just not in Arusa, or just not in the language in which the CACs are used. So that's kind of, it's much like other, well, the example I have in mind is not really paralinguistic, but often you have phonetic restrictions on idiophones. Sometimes you have phonemes that only occur in idiophones and aren't even phonemes, maybe. And that's also subject to debate and analysis, depending on how you do stuff. But just like many other paralinguistic things, for example, one European language had like this thing where to say no, you make a click and put your head up, I think. Or maybe I'm misremembering.
Or like the English.
Yeah, true.
That's a paralinguistic thing that is specific to English, and we don't have a way to write it because it doesn't use normal English phonemes. Like it uses clicks that like are linguistic sounds in languages that have clicks, but that's like the only time you use a click in English is to say the thing that gets transcribed in Winnie the Pooh as tisk tisk or tut tut. Yeah. And if you've only ever read it and then only ever heard it, like it'll be a major revelation when you grow up and eventually somebody tells you, oh yeah, that's pronounced... I don't know if that came across on the microphone. That's pronounced... I can't do it on command. Dang it.
No worries. But yeah, that's basically the thing.
Another example from Arusa that I think is pretty illustrative is that they have a particular call, gu, which uses g, which is a perfectly normal pulmonic consonant that just happens to not be a sound in Arusa Maasai.
Yeah.
And it's totally a sound in a lot of other languages. It's not even like a click, which is like, well, yeah, it's in some languages. It's like, no, this is just a normal linguistic sound that just happens to not be in Maasai, but except it is in this one particular CAC.
Yeah, that's basically the deal with phonetic material in CACs. They tend to be extra systematic. They tend to use sounds that aren't used regularly in the language.
It's worth talking a little bit about the properties, like the structural properties of CACs, because it's like they're made up of more than one segment, usually. And you get an interesting range of things. A lot of them don't have vowels the way normal words do.
Like...
Some of them are just pure single consonants repeated, especially if they're relatively audible, like clicks or something. Some of them are like s or sh. Some of them are sk, shk, like where there's a sequence of different consonants, but they're still not actually a vowel. And apparently these are cross-linguistically common, the authors claim, to have conative animal calls that don't involve vowels, but still have some sort of internal structure. It's also worth noting that sometimes the structure is a little bit correlated with the use in a kind of iconic way, maybe, where, like, summons calls, come here, tends to use repetition. Like you get the same thing repeated several times, whereas dispersals tend to be sort of punctual, monosyllabic. I think one of the ones they have here is you. Like, they tend to be much more just instantaneous, like, get a noise out there to like, scare the animal, basically. So even the use of individual CACs impacts their internal structure, their internal phonetic structure.
Yeah, I mean, that's also, iconicity, the big debate. Is it really iconicity? Is it really a thing? I think it's really nice how whatever type of linguistic paper you read, you will stumble across some discussion of some feature that is like pervasive in every aspect of linguistics, such as iconicity, because you see it so often, and it's really interesting. Whether it's like super intuitive, like, okay, I say this verb first and this verb last, so that must be in the sequence of happening. That makes sense, but iconicity is so much more. We should maybe do a nice episode about iconicity sometime.
Yeah, that would be fun. So, speaking of iconicity, I think it's worth... They mention a little bit about where CACs tend to come from, or at least where they seem to have come from in Maasai. And the vast majority of the ones that they've cataloged, it's like 40-something out of like 45, 46. Those are what they call primary CACs, which are basically, these were created as animal calls. They're not from some other like diachronic source. This includes all of the stuff with the extra-systemic phonetics. This includes the onomatopoeias and so forth. This is the stuff that's created as a way to make an animal call. And some of them are just like noises. They're just sort of arbitrarily associated sequence of consonants, or maybe you get something like, I think they have, ru or suk and things like that are just sort of arbitrarily assigned to a particular CAC kind of a meaning. But they also have stuff like meow or something, which is like to call a cat. And you're like, oh yeah, I can see where that came from. So that's one, very major source of CACs. But not every CAC is created as one. You also have ones that are derived from actual linguistic sources, language internal etymologies. Often they're things like come, go, let's go. One of the ones in Maasai is actually a vocative form of goat, like hey goat. I think that's specialized to like get a goat's attention to come over to you, but like still it's from the vocative form of the word goat. So you do get some of these internal etymologies, and this is where you get a lot of the CACs that actually are valid phonological words, is that they are either they're just straight up valid grammatical forms that mean go or let's go or something, and they may be used slightly differently. Like, I think the example in the paper is that the call for like get your cows moving along with you is actually a singular like hortative let's get moving, but you just use it for any time you're trying to get a cow or more cows moving. And I think there's a couple of examples of ones that this is slightly phonetically reduced from what the actual like source is. But in any case, you can get these out of actual real, language internal material where they're actually part of the system, and they kind of get brought out of it a little bit to become animal calls instead of just plain old words with actual internal morphology and everything. And then the last category that they mention of possible sources is actually loan words. There's a couple of CACs in Arusa Maasai that are borrowings from Kiswahili. And I don't know if they're used as CACs in Kiswahili. They might be. They are totally nonsensical inside Maasai. Like, they don't have any, they may as well just be an interjection with no internal structure. But it is complicated a little bit by the fact that probably most Maasai speakers understand enough Kiswahili to understand the internal structure of these CACs and to recognize what they would mean in Kiswahili. So I'm not exactly sure like where those fall on the, how intensely grammaticalized, for lack of almost like de-grammaticalized in a sense.
Well, grammaticalized is not a bad term, because that's a good segue into the next section, because it turns out that CACs have some unique grammatical properties as well.
Yeah. So one of the first things that the paper mentions is holophrasticity. And we were already talking before we started recording, and I was saying, I think this week I've read like 3 or 4 papers, primarily about polysynthesis, what's the problem with polysynthesis, stuff like that. Haspelmatt and Fernando Zuniga, those people basically kind of, dismembering polysynthesis and saying why it's not a good thing. Amidst this discussion, there was also mentions of holophrasticity. So I was, I finished the Zuniga paper, and I was like, okay, now let's take a look at the paper for our recording session. And I looked through the paper, and I see holophrasticity, and I'm like, is this term haunting me? Because it's so often, maybe it's just my bias, but I've encountered it so often. So what does it actually mean? Basically, in this context of this research of CACs, that means that CACs can actually stand alone as full non-elliptical utterances and function like that. They can just say, for example, and it will work. It will be an utterance, and you don't have to add anything else. It's not a non-elliptical. It's just, that's it. That's your utterance. And for fun, I can just briefly expand on what it means in the discussion of polysynthesis, because in polysynthesis discussions, holophrasticity basically says that the arguments are that the word as much as it is a meaningful unit in typology at all, but that the clause itself, that the whole thing, the argument structure, is basically conveyed by one utterance, so that you don't have like a subject pronoun and an object pronoun. You just have this one unit, which might be a verb with polypersonal agreement, for example. And that's one of the key parts what people sometimes say that polysynthesis is based on, holophrastic clauses, that you just have arguments marked directly on the predicate. But that's not the same thing. Like, it's kind of the same, but not really the same. It's just, I suppose, a very general term.
Well, holophrastic basically just means the entire phrase.
Yeah. I feel like this is a more intense definition of holophrasis, though, because this is an instance where it's not like if you have a complex verb with a whole bunch of stuff in there that happens to be one word, and that one word is the whole sentence. It's like, okay, cool. Like, you got a bunch of stuff going on there. It's not all that surprising. But these are individual single morphemes with no internal structure that can be the entire sentence and stand on their own. So I think this is a little bit more useful, meaningful, a use of the word holophrastic, because this is a single unit with no internal structure, nothing complicated going on. It's just a thing that in and of itself is allowed to be an entire utterance.
Yeah, and I'm primarily familiar with the term previously from child language acquisition, because children go through a phase of language acquisition called the holophrastic phase, where they are capable of uttering single words in isolation before they start to develop grammatical structure and, produce multi-word utterances. But anyway, that has nothing to do with this actual paper. So, aside from potentially being holophrastic, it turns out CACs are distinguished from the general category of interjections, again, because even though they are usually holophrastic, they can be used as parts of larger sentences and integrated into the grammar, where they behave like predicates. So they can take adjuncts. You can tell a dog to go in a certain direction, with a prepositional phrase, or to hunt a particular thing, giving it an object. And so that really distinguishes them from emotive interjections. And they seem kind of like quasi-verbs from that one famous paper, English Sentences Without Overt Grammatical Subjects, which is all about how swear words work in English. And, they're not actually verbs because you can't provide them with a subject, but they are a thing that, can be part of a clause and take adjuncts and arguments and so forth. So I'm not going to give any examples directly from that other paper because they are all highly offensive. But go read it on your own and then make comparisons to CACs.
Yeah, but English has CACs that do this. The English phrase sick 'em.
Yes.
When you're telling a dog to attack a person or group of people, it's sort of phonetically unclear whether you're saying them or him. That is exactly what's happening here, where you've got a CAC, sick, which is for a dog to be commanded to attack something, plus an object. And it's clear that sick is not really a verb. Like, you can't say, I sicked them on him. Like, that's weird. Like, maybe... But that's kind of a case of, deriving it into a verb rather than, oh, yeah, it's just a verb.
Yep.
Doesn't mean it can't take an object, though, and, sick-em is way more common than just sick on its own, which is super interesting. So, yep. Yeah, and then this is a thing that happens in Maasai as well, where you have exactly the same phenomenon. Certain CACs can take objects just in the same way, but they're still CACs by every other measure.
And additionally, they tend to be clause initial, again, much like interjections. So this is another place where, like Jacob, I would really like to see more cross-linguistic data, because they don't have to be clause initial. Just like you can stick an interjection in the middle of another sentence, you can stick a CAC in the middle of another sentence, if it's semantically appropriate. But they apparently tend to be clause initial, and I don't really know anything about the grammar of Maasai. This is not a language I have studied prior to this paper at all, but I wonder if that interacts with the usual positions of verbs. Like, if you have an SOV language, and then you go and study their CACs specifically, are you going to find that the complex ones that can have more grammar around them, do they still show up clause initially, or do they kind of like start to pattern like other predicates in the language? I don't know.
Right. So, I think we've talked plenty about what CACs look like in Arusa. And so now the section 4, I think, of the paper basically tries to do the whole framework thing that we talked at the very beginning. Basically, prototype theory, what kind of prototypes of CACs are there. And there are, as we said, a bunch, like at least 4.5 pages of just paragraphs of different properties that are very prototypical of CACs, that are less prototypical, that are somewhere in the middle. And we won't bore you with these qualities because I think we've talked about the paper a lot now. And if you still want to check something out, and we're doing this as incentive for you to read the paper, and so we won't discuss the entirety, so you still have got something left to read maybe. But this list is pretty interesting, I must say. When I first saw it, I was like, yeah, I'm gonna read that eventually, but not now. But yeah, take a look at it, because it's really nicely done, you know? Really nice application, as we said, of prototype theory onto typology, which is...
Without reading out explicitly the entire list of qualities of the prototype, I think you can get a good idea of just the practical effect of using a prototypical definition for CACs by paying attention to how many times we say words like tend to and usually and often in the whole preceding episode.
Yeah.
Yeah. And also, like, you know, if you don't know that you're going to necessarily have time or attention to spend on that, I think we've hit most of the properties just in the top, you know, in the discussion about Arusa and, you know, in general. I don't know that there's anything in that section that it's like, oh yeah, we didn't mention this, because they kind of back up most of those in the preceding body of the paper by giving examples from Arusa Maasai. So you probably have gotten a lot of it at this point anyway, but yeah, if you want to see like a boiling down and a sort of synthesis of all those ideas into like, here is a list of 15 or 20 points that CACs are characterized by in some combination, then like, yeah, there's totally a great write-up of that at the end of the paper.
Theory Neutral is made possible by our listeners, families, and friends. Follow us on Blue Sky at Theory Neutral, or send us an email at theory.neutral.podcast@gmail.com. Join us next time when we will be discussing middle voice systems.